Good evening, brothers and sisters. We are here again one more time for you, and hopefully a few more times, but we're here again tonight. Welcome you to a great show that we have for you tonight lined up. I know a lot of you took interest as when you first saw the advertisement for this one, and I know you were looking forward to a great conversation. Um, so as usual, we want to get started, get right into this. So I wanted to welcome you all tonight, but let's get right into the meat and potatoes of it. But before we get and do that, there's some things we have to do according to the housekeeping things we always do at the beginning of the show. So I'm gonna kick it over to my brother Isaac, and then we'll kick it back over to me. We'll go from there.
Peace, Grant. How are you feeling tonight, good brother?
Good man, glad to be here. Excited.
Okay, good. So we're gonna get started in just a second with our program. We're gonna let our friends log on, and I see that the numbers are growing. We have 13 friends with us now. I know that number will continue to grow. So for those that are just joining us for the first time, 360 Collective is a social commentary group designed to confront, discuss issues of race, skin color, racial justice, racial injustice. And so, over the course of the past couple of years, where we've been having these online forums, we've been fortunate to meet and politic with experts in the field, with comrades and allies and friends who are on the ground, in the streets, making change in their own communities. And we have a special guest tonight who will not disappoint, who will lend their own expertise to the ongoing cause, which we feel so passionately about. Now, through these conversations that we've had, we feel very strongly about including listeners in the conversation. And so tonight, because we will have lots of friends listening and viewing, we may not be able to get everyone directly into the conversation to participate and interact with us, but we at least want to get your questions through the chat that we can pass along to Professor Vitale, who we will introduce in just a second. Again, we're here to learn and to do the knowledge just like you are. And therefore, we will ask questions, but we want to include your questions along with ours to get to our esteemed guest tonight. So don't hesitate to react. Don't hesitate to ask questions because we will stop every couple questions, every few minutes to visit the chat and make sure that we're getting to your reactions and your wonderings. We believe in doing the knowledge together, creating knowledge together, and tonight will be no different. So the subject for tonight is called "The End of Policing: An Evening with Alex Vitale." This is a topic that we feel very strongly about because the murder of George Floyd, the killing of Breonna Taylor, highlighted on a national level serious inequities in policing here in America. But for those who are our age, middle aged, you know very well that this has been happening for a long time, and you can go back through history to understand how police and agents of the law have systematically oppressed people of color, working people, organized labor movements, and so on and so forth. And our guest tonight has done a lot of research on this important topic, and he has some really interesting, we think, revolutionary ideas about how we move forward, how we make our world, we make our country and our society a better place. And so, with that said, I'm excited to have Alex Vitale with us tonight. But Grant, why don't you read to us Professor Vitale's resume, and then we will jump into some questions with him.
Sure. So Alex Vitale is an associate professor of sociology at Brooklyn College. He has been studying police practices for over 25 years. He has written two books: City of Disorder, How the Quality of Life Campaign Transformed New York Politics, and The End of Policing. He is a member of the New York State Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and consults human rights groups, police departments, and community-based organizations internationally. So it's my pleasure to welcome you, um, our guest, Alex Vitale.
Thank you, Grant. Thank you, Isaac. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always great to know that people are engaging one's work. That's music to any author's ears. But even more importantly, no struggle can develop without political education, without engaging ideas. And so it's really exciting anytime I have the opportunity to be in conversation with people who are actually, trying to do the work on the ground.
All right. Thank you, Professor Vitale. So with that, we'd love to start with a few questions. And we'd love to know a little bit more about your background and how you came to feel so strongly about issues of social justice and policing in particular. But I know one thing that is on everybody's mind today, not only here, but around the world, is what's happening in Europe and specifically in Ukraine. So I'm curious to know, what are your feelings about what's happening in Ukraine? What's your sense of what's happening there? What was your reaction when Russia invaded Ukraine and everything that's happened since then?
So I don't have a huge amount to say about this, but it's obviously deeply concerning, and I will just say that there is plenty of blame to go around here. As much as I support the isolation of Russia for its military adventurism, the US and Europe bear some responsibility for the way it has used NATO to encroach on, Russia and its sovereignty. And so there's plenty of blame to go around. Generally, I'm supportive of intensifying sanctions and opposed to, direct military involvement. We don't need an escalation of the war. We need an escalation of the consequences for engaging in war.
Mm-hmm. Right on, right on. I appreciate that take, Professor Vitale. I agree with you wholeheartedly. There's a lot more to this issue than meets the eye, and we don't always get the whole truth in the media about the deeper history and our own behavior in that region. But thank you for indulging in that briefly. Now back to you and your work. I'm really interested. Everyone whom I've ever met, and Grant and I ourselves have interesting stories about how we came to meet each other. Every person who cares deeply about social justice has a story. How is it that you came to become so passionate about issues of justice or injustice, and what was the inspiration for this book?
So, I grew up in a political household. My father had been an elected official in a small coal mining town in Illinois. The Vitales were coal miners going back to my great grandfather. So it was a union household with deep roots in the labor movement, but also was involved in the racial justice movement. I grew up in the 1960s and 70s in Houston, and my parents were active in racial justice struggles there. So I grew up in a mixed race neighborhood. So these were, sort of formative experiences for me. Now, I hadn't intended to work on or study or be active specifically about policing. I had gone to school really studying things like community development corporations, enterprise zones, community-based housing, and was working after college at the San Francisco Coalition on Homelessness, doing that kind of work. But that was the period where we began to see the real ramping up of the criminalization of homelessness. Cities basically giving up on the idea that they were going to house these growing numbers of people and instead turn the problem over to the police. And my boss at the time asked me to start working on that aspect of the problem. And that really brought home to me the way in which policing has been used historically to manage a set of social problems that people in power don't really want to deal with in a just and meaningful way.
Got it. Okay, thank you for that. I guess thinking about the book and how it all came together, tell us a little bit. This is just to build upon that response. Tell us about the process of writing the book, So that's how you became in policing in particular. What were the steps that led you to say, I need to write a book about this?
Yeah.
I need to share or look into this more and share these important pieces of information, this important research with others.
So I had been working as a kind of police scholar. There's a sort of group of intellectuals around the world who study policing. And I had been going to conferences and working with some police departments and working with human rights groups and trying to write some critical stuff about policing, but really engaging the literature and observing policing firsthand. At the same time, there was a growing literature about prison abolition and about mass incarceration, the problems of mass incarceration. And I was teaching a lot of this literature, but there was very little being written that was critical of policing. And I felt that this was a kind of weakness in the conversation, that, no one ends up in prison unless the police get involved. And the police enact a lot of harm on individuals and communities that don't involve anyone going to prison. For instance, they kill over 1,000 people a year. That doesn't have anything to do with mass incarceration. So I actually had the agreement, the contract to write this book before Ferguson happened, before Eric Garner was killed. I thought basically I was going to be intervening in that conversation with critical criminologists to say, hey, let's keep policing in mind. And I hoped it would find its way into the hand of some activists, and I tried to write it for a broad audience. But of course, I had no idea it would achieve the kind of audience that it has. I'll just say one more thing, that after Ferguson happened, the killing of Mike Brown and the killing of Eric Garner, I was just beginning the actual writing of the book. And I made a decision to kind of put the writing of the book aside temporarily and spend some time while the issue was on the front pages, writing short essays, op-eds in newspapers, to try to push some of these ideas, because what I had seen historically was that something terrible would happen, like the beating of Rodney King, and there would be a period of a year or two of public interest in the issue of policing, and then very quickly it would fade away. I had been active. I was living in California during the Rodney King riots and was involved in activism around that. I was involved in activism around the killing of Amadou Diallo here in New York City. And I had seen this over and over again. And I felt like there needed to be a kind of deeper analysis of policing that moved us away from some of either the superficial reforms that we often hear, and also away from the idea that if we just indict a few police officers, that's going to fix the problem. And so that was one of the other big motivations for writing the book.
Okay. All right. There's so much there to unpack. I appreciate it very much. I think there's another question coming later where we can explore, I think, some of the really important things that you said there. But I want to jump into one more question. And then, Grant, after that, we can check the chat and see what's going on there. So our next question, Professor Vitale, is that one of the fascinating aspects of your text is where the institution of policing came from. And you start early in your book to outline some of that history, strike breaking, slave patrols. You talked a little bit about that earlier. Social control, I think, is how you described it. Why is it so important for us to understand where policing comes from? Why did you start your book with a discussion about the history of policing?
Yeah, I think it's crucial, and therefore I'm going to maybe just take a few minutes here to answer that question, because I think it's super important. So normally we're told that policing is about the kind of neutral professional enforcement of the law, and that enforcement of the law benefits everyone, that it creates this nice level playing field that's good for everyone. But this is a kind of myth making about what police really do. Policing always develops as a tool for managing the consequences of systems of exploitation, whether it's colonialism, slavery, or mass industrialization. We see policing develop in the 17 and 1800s in direct relationship to those things, to give the state a tool to suppress slave revolts, to prevent anti-colonial movements from gaining power, to disrupt workers' movements, but also to suppress what is called crime. But crime is usually defined as the behavior of working class people who are on the losing end of these arrangements of exploitation, whether it's working class pleasures like vice, drinking too much, maybe getting into a fight, driving cars that are too loud, all these things, or property crime and even interpersonal violence. The harms committed by bankers and landlords aren't called crime. Police don't respond when your boss steals your wages. And yet those harms are actually much more profound for vulnerable communities than street crime. The value of wage theft by employers is greater than all property crime combined in the United States. And when politicians poison entire cities' water supply, we don't call the police about that, right? So we misunderstand this idea that police are here to keep us safe, to solve our problems. When push comes to shove, their job is to put a lid on resistance and disorder that threatens those systems exploitation.
Man, you're dropping knowledge, Professor Vitale. That's enlightening to be sure. Thank you for that. This has been wonderful so far. Lots of questions in the chat, so I'd like to pause to try to get to a couple of those, and then we'll continue with the questions that we've prepared.
Yeah, let's look at a couple of questions here. I'm going to start in the order in which I saw them come in. First, we'll start with Joe Welling's questions. He said he's so disappointed in Biden's State of the Union comment. How do we combat the knee-jerking reflex that so many people have against defund the police? And how can we invite them to examine why they have that response?
So let's draw a distinction here between Biden and a whole set of professional politicians on the one hand and the general public. So elected officials like Biden and the big campaign contributors that support him and the mainstream media that backs him up, they are committed to some of these regimes of exploitation. They're committed to a kind of system of neoliberal austerity. We don't have slavery and colonialism in that 19th century sense anymore. What we have is a system of global competition backed up by government austerity, in which governments have cut budgets to reward already successful economic actors like Wall Street, real estate, Amazon, giving them subsidies, tax breaks, deregulation, in hopes that they'll become so successful on the global stage that some of that wealth will trickle down to the rest of us. But that hasn't happened, right? Instead of getting a broad prosperity, we've gotten massive inequality. So now we have a class of billionaires. I read somewhere there were about 750 billionaires in the United States now. But on the other side, we now have mass homelessness, mass untreated mental health and substance abuse problems, failed schools, mass participation in black market activity of drugs and sex work and stolen goods because people are economically desperate. And those problems are turned into problems of crime to be managed by policing. So Biden doesn't want to do anything about these inequalities. He remains committed to cutting social services and unleashing corporate power. So he needs policing to put a lid on all the social problems that emerge as a result of that. So he doesn't want to defund the police because he's using the police to cover up his political project that is harming the rest of us. This is different than the general public in some ways, though, right? For the general public, they also may be on the losing end of these arrangements, but for generations, they've been told the only tool they can have to address very real community problems like violence and disorder is policing. And then when they first hear this idea of defund the police, they think, wait a second, you want to take away the one thing we've been told we can have. That doesn't sound very reassuring to me. So the challenge for the movement is to do two things. One is it has to be clear about its opposition to austerity, to turning the government over to the 1/10 of 1%, to demand real economic equity and using the force of government to help achieve that. And on the other hand, it has to make clear that what we're trying to do here is not to make people less safe, it's to make people more safe. The fact is, we have a lot of very robust examples of things that we could be doing other than policing to produce public safety that are cheaper, more effective, and don't come with all the harmful consequences of relying on policing. Whether you're concerned about opioid overdoses, car break-ins, sexual assaults, gang violence, policing is not very effective at dealing with those things, comes with huge costs, and we have real alternatives that would be better. And we just need to have those conversations with people. And what we see is when there's real grassroots, face-to-face community organizing where we have a chance to really explain these ideas to people, there's a lot of support for them. But when all people hear is defund the police on the nightly news, described in really negative and dishonest ways, then they think this doesn't sound like a good idea for them.
Great response to that question. I think the next question you kind of answered some of what they're asking, but I'll read it anyway. And I think there's one part you may have not touched on. But Charles Alexander says, with the increase of gun violence in many American cities during the pandemic, what are your thoughts on ending policing in this type of violent environment? What steps, what preventative measures you would take, and what recommendations would you give to end gun violence?
So that's a hugely important question, and that does allow us to cover some additional territory, which is to say that we do need a plan to deal with violence, even if violence hadn't gone up these last 2 years. And I'll just remind people that actually crime overall is down in the United States. It did not go up. Shootings went up, which of course is one of the most serious and important types of crime that we must deal with. But the forces of order and policing have used this uptick in crime not to make people safer, but to keep the spigot open of funding for policing, to push back on demands for real community justice. So what should we do about violence? What should we do about the shootings? Well, first of all, homicides are not all one thing. This is one of the problems with relying on policing. Are we talking about domestic violence shootings? Are we talking about young people battling over territory and honor? Are we talking about armed robberies? Are we talking about spree killings? Are we talking about serial killers? We need strategies to address each of those specific problems. And they're very different strategies. They're not all one size fits all strategies. So youth violence is obviously one of the most serious and widespread of these. So, what can we do about that? Well, policing has not been very effective. Sometimes they will flood a neighborhood with police, hound a certain population of young people. And yes, sometimes that brings a temporary reduction in the shootings, but it very quickly comes back. What are we doing to really change the conditions of the lives of those young people who are most likely to be involved in violence? That's really the challenge for us. And there are a variety of things we can do. We see a growing number of cities investing in violence interruption strategies. These involve hiring people from the community to work with young people to try to break the cycle of violence. We know that so much of this violence is retributive. You shot my cousin, so now I'm going to shoot you. And then that person's brother is going to come and find you. And then your best friend is going to go, right? So there's a legacy of trauma and a cycle of violence. And policing just plays into that. It just produces more violence and more trauma in the lives of these young people. So I'll give you one example of how this might work. In several cities now, if a young person comes into the emergency room having been shot or stabbed, they are assigned a caseworker from their own neighborhood who immediately begins to work with them and everybody else who shows up at the hospital to say, hey, let's really look at what's going on here. Let's think about what's really in the best interest of the community. How can we move forward here without more shootings, more violence? How can we kind of calm the situation down? For one thing, we've seen lots of cases where someone gets shot, comes into the hospital, doesn't really know who did it, and then everyone just goes off literally half-cocked and starts thinking they know who did it and then shoots someone who had nothing to do with it. Let's slow this down. Let's try to engage people in conversation. We can do that in the community as well. These programs, when they're well-funded and well-run, have shown very positive results in dramatically reducing the level of shootings, much more effectively than policing. We need to look at like social inclusion strategies, bringing young people into opportunities, into decision-making. We need to look at things like the advanced peace model that began in California. It identifies young people at high risk of involvement in violence, and it enrolls them in support services and pays them a stipend to keep them engaged. And if they meet certain targets, showing up to classes, getting their GED, staying clean and sober, they get bonuses, additional financial support. So it combines the fact that these young people need access to money, which drives a lot of the problematic behavior, and it gives them social supports and positive reinforcement. This stuff works. But see, what it does is it requires putting money in the pockets of poor Black and brown people, not into the pockets of bankers. And so the Bidens and the Lori Lightfoots and the other big city mayors, they don't like that. They were put in office by the bankers. And we have to demand that instead of bankrupting city government to give tax breaks to billionaires, we've got to invest in the young people in our communities to give them real opportunities and help them deal with the trauma and the stress and the sense of danger that they face every day. And that's how we stop the violence.
So, Professor Vitale, you've begun to talk about some of the alternatives to policing. And so in the next few minutes, we'll continue with that. But I know that there's one particular part of your text in the conclusion that it sounds like, based on some of our previous conversation, has caused a little bit of confusion. And so that particular sentence this is in a newer edition, the 2018 edition of the book. You begin the conclusion by saying policing needs to be reformed. However, you don't actually believe in police reform as the answer. So clear that up
Yeah.
for us and listeners. What is it that you're calling for exactly?
Yeah. So there is a newer edition of the book that came out in December where I tried to clarify that. And I essentially dropped that sentence because it was confusing in exactly the way that you suggested. What I was trying to say there was not so much that police need to be reformed in the technical sense. What I was trying to say is that policing is obviously broken. Policing doesn't work. It is abusive. It is racially discriminatory and is harmful. But we're not going to fix it with implicit bias training and body cameras and community policing and throwing a few cops in jail. That's not going to fix it. Those kinds of reforms don't work. They've never worked. And they don't work because they fundamentally misunderstand the nature of the problem. They think there's a couple of bad officers out there who, if we just gave them some training or replace them with someone who was better, that this would solve the problem. But the problem is so much bigger than that. You know, the police are actually doing what they've been asked to do. Our elected officials have told the police to wage a war on drugs and a war on crime and a war on gangs and a war on terror. And so they are at war with huge segments of the population. And guess what happens in a war? People get killed. They get abused. And there are horrible outcomes. And the solution to that is to get rid of the wars, to get the police out of the drug business, out of the sex work business, out of the homelessness business, out of our schools, out of the mental health business, which would dramatically reduce the negative impacts that they have on the everyday lives of the most vulnerable communities in our society.
So this is a bit off the script, but it's a reaction to what you're saying, Professor Vitale. Grant and I both have lots of friends who are radical, and Grant and I each hold very radical beliefs ourselves, but we don't subscribe to the belief that any police officer is an enemy of the people or an enemy of the cause. We see it more as a systemic issue. In other words, I have a good friend who's a police officer, and he hates the system almost as much as I do, and he tries to do as much as he can from the inside as he can. And I'm careful not to judge him because of the occupation that he has chosen. But he also knows very clearly how I feel about the institution of policing, regardless of the people who are in the uniforms or behind the desks and so forth. So, maybe my interpretation is wrong, but what's your reaction to that? What are your thoughts on that?
I agree with you completely. You know, I have friends who are police all over the world, who I speak to regularly. And I've been very careful not to make this about police are bad people. Any more than I would say that, you know, some soldier who gets drafted either by a draft or the poverty draft and kills someone, you know, is a murderer. Now, they've been put in a situation. They've been given a mission. They've been given a gun and told to go out and do that. And so we got to focus on where the real decision making is happening. You know, this is not about some implicit bias on the part of some police officer that's producing 11 million unjust arrests every year, killing over 1,000 people every year. This is a system, and police are stuck in it. Out of the, you know, who else is going to hire them? A lot of them at that pay with those benefits. It's a poverty draft.
Yep.
And what I've said to young people and older, you know, police officers come to my talks and I speak to them and I say to them, you know, I remember I had some police officers come to a talk I gave in Houston a few years ago, black and brown police officers. And they said, look, when we were younger, we had bad experiences with the police. We wanted to do something positive for the community, and we thought maybe we could help fix policing from the inside. And they said it didn't work. It was pointless. We made no positive impact. And I said, yeah, there's no fixing like the culture of policing. And I said, look, if you had a choice between a job as a police officer or a job working in a community center, coaching football and mentoring kids for the same pay and benefits, which job would you have taken? And of course they laughed and they would, oh man, we would have loved to have coached football and work with kids, but there were no jobs like that. And I said, exactly. There are never, ever jobs like that. There are none. No such jobs exist. Because even when there is ever so rarely a job working with young people in that way, it doesn't pay what a police officer gets paid. Nowhere near it.
Mm-hmm.
So where are those jobs? Why don't we have those jobs for young people in the community who want to do something positive? Mm-hmm. Instead of telling them the only job is to work as a cop or a jail guard or a corrections officer.
Mm-hmm. So you're being very clear now that you don't believe in police reform. You believe in ending police and the institution as we know it today. And so with that said, in all of the conversations and the work and advocacy that you're part of, I imagine that there are people who may agree that there are systematic problems with policing, could be taken aback by that position. And they might have trouble imagining a world without police. So how are you able to imagine such a world, and how would a world without police work?
So look, I don't start from the premise, oh, there's this potential utopia that I've imagined, and now, we just have to figure out how to get there. It's much more. First of all, my position has always been that we need to reduce policing in as many ways as we possibly can. Does that mean no police? I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not sure what the end of that process is. I know that 75-85% of what police do now is a bad idea, and we have very good alternatives for dealing with it. So for me, when we talk about like police abolition, what that means to me is it's about a process of reducing our reliance on policing in very concrete ways right now. Like tomorrow, we could hire counselors and create services for young people that would allow us to get rid of school policing. We could do that. And in fact, dozens of cities in the last 3 years have done that. They didn't reform school policing. They eliminated it and replaced it with something better. We could do that right now. Would there still be police? Yes, there would still be police. We got to work on that next part, right? Let's get them out of the mental health business. Okay, we see cities all across the country creating non-police crisis response teams to respond to mental health crisis calls. These teams work. They're saving lives. They're reducing police violence. They're reducing our need for policing. Are there still police? Yes. So let's work on the next thing. Let's get rid of the gang units. Let's replace them with community-based anti-violence efforts like I discussed earlier. Let's get the police out of homelessness response and actually start trying to house people instead. What's left at the end of that process? I don't know what's left. And whatever is left, we'll look at that next and see where that leads us. And it's also an analysis, abolition. It's an analysis. It says, look, policing is part of the problem. Policing is an inherently problematic institution. It's rooted in the mobilization of violence to protect people's benefits, privileges, to protect people's privileges. And we need something better than that.
Okay. So you've convinced me now, Professor. You've convinced me. You've convinced our audience. I'm down for the cause. I want to join the work. So in our discussions and in the work that Grant and I and our other comrade Amari are doing as 360, we try to think of the work in three ways. There's personal development, then there's our private lives with friends and families, immediate neighbors, and then there's the work we do publicly, more broadly in our community with people that we may not know as well as our next door neighbor. So to realize the vision that you've laid out in your text and now in our conversation, where do our listeners start? What would you recommend that they do?
Well, I think we have to do all three of those things. Now, which we do exactly first or whatever, that depends on our own life situation. So we have to address that impulse that we all have as human beings to rely on vengeance, retribution, threats, and control to address our everyday challenges. I know I have to deal with that in relationship to raising my own children. We always feel that pressure to come down hard to solve a problem. And we have to try to kill the cop in our head that says that's how we solve problems. And we have to try to figure out how to relate to people on a basis of solidarity and mutual understanding and respect, not one of coercion and control and threats. Mm-hmm. And in terms of the next layer out, we have to talk with people about what kinds of resources we can mobilize to address problems without having to get police involved. Do we really know our neighbors? Do we know who we would call in a time of crisis other than the police who might really be able to provide support? A family member, a close friend? Have we taken the time to identify the kind of organized resources in the community? Maybe I'm concerned about kids getting into fights on my street or keeping me up at night. Well, do you know the parents of the kids? Do you know the person who works at the rec center that the kids hang out at? Is there someone you can talk to develop a relationship with those kids, directly or indirectly, to try to work that problem out without endangering their lives by calling the police? Because that's what you're doing when you call the police. You're endangering their lives, either from direct, immediate police violence or the long-term implications of being involved with the criminal justice system. So we have some people do what's called pod mapping. People like Miriam Kaba, for instance, have laid out ways of doing this where we work as individuals and families and collectivities to identify resources, to create, hotline numbers, et cetera. In Oakland, they've tried to do this on a neighborhood-wide basis in places so that there's a crisis number you can call and there's a community response to whatever the problem is. And then finally, we have to relate to the larger government. They're sending the police. And even if we don't want them, they will come and insert themselves into our lives unless we do something about it. So that means we've got to have organized campaigns to get the police out of our schools. We've got to have organized campaigns to demand that we have drug treatment on demand, that we have high quality neighborhood-based mental health services, that we have the resources that communities need to be healthy, safe, and productive places. And that requires collective political action.
One of the things that I'm taking away from what you're saying, Professor, is that the idea of ending policing, the idea of abolishing police is aspirational, and we should struggle towards it, but we should do it in very specific ways by reducing the role that the police play in our communities and in our institutions. And you mentioned a few: mental health, expanding mental health support so that there are more resources available for people in that condition, as opposed to the police being called, that there's an extra counselor in the school as opposed to a police officer who will deal with a child who may be having a mental breakdown of some kind. Do I understand your vision correctly?
Yes, and we have to develop specific interventions tailored to address the specific problems that we confront. Not every community has the same set of problems.
Yeah.
And we need strategies that are tailored to the not just the needs of the community, but the nature of the community. Are those responses culturally appropriate? Do people speak the right language? Do they understand the community? Are they in a position to act with respect towards people because they understand their religion or their cultural background? These things are important too. And of course, policing is terrible at that.
So Grant, I think you may have a couple more questions in the chat. I know we're just about out of time with our good friend Professor Vitale, but I want to make sure that we get a couple questions before he leaves us.
Yeah, I see there's a few here, and I want to be respectful to people who have definitely put questions in and expecting an answer. And some of these have probably somewhat have been covered, and I see even one question was answered by someone else in the chat. But I'm going to at least read a few of these here. So Elaine Simmons says, State versus Nelson is the first police officer being charged for murdering Jesse Saray in over 30 years under I-94 in Washington State. He is currently under house arrest and on Auburn payroll. Our family has been waiting 16 months for the murder trial to start. His house arrest will be time served. My question is, why are cities willing to pay out millions for civil suits and keep bad apples on their force?
Because they're not bad apples. They're just regular police officers. Every police officer is capable of doing what that officer did. And what those officers are doing is exactly what they've been asked to do, to use violence to cover up a set of social problems that people higher up the food chain have created. And that's why cities go to such great lengths to defend these officers, because they're doing what they were told to do. There is no magical policing that doesn't produce these outcomes. This is what policing does. If you don't want violence, murder, and racism, don't get the police involved. So this is the problem. We want there to be consequences for these officers, but the system that we're turning to, the legal system, was designed to allow officers to do these things. We're not going to get justice out of that system. That's not what that system was created for. That's an illusion. That's a myth. And even in those rare cases, like in Minneapolis, where an officer gets jailed or incarcerated, right? Did that fix policing?
Right.
Did that bring back the dead person? Did that create racial justice in that city? Mm-hmm. No. You know why they put Derek Chauvin in prison? To preserve policing.
To counteract the movement, right?
To counteract the movement. The police department turned against him and said, we better put this guy in prison or they're going to cancel our entire budget and put us all out of work. Right? They had to sacrifice him to save the institution. Mm-hmm. That's not my idea of how we get justice. That's just preserving the system. So it's very hard, very hard. I mean, I can't imagine the trauma experienced by family members who lose someone to police violence. But the sad reality is that no amount of putting those cops in prison is going to bring justice. It's going to change the conditions in the neighborhood. It's just not. As long as the politics of policing remains what it is, that they are at war with the community, and that's their basic mission, then people are going to keep getting killed.
Okay.
Professor, was there another one, Grant? I'm sorry.
Yeah, there's another one. Let's see if we get one more in here. Barbara Kinney says, do you think there is a need for a small number of armed police to go along with more mental health services or youth services, or do you think they can get to a place where there is no police because everything can be handled in another way?
Okay, so what we can do right now is we can create completely non-police mental health teams, and we can start sending them on a growing number of calls. The cities that are doing this have great results. They're not calling for police backup. No one is getting shot. Denver's new STARS program, which has been around for almost a year now, is diverting a huge number of 911 calls. They never seem to need police backup, and no violence is occurring. It is the presence of an armed police officer that triggers most of the violence. You take it when someone is being confronted by a civilian mental health worker, they don't need to engage in any violence. There's just someone trying to talk to them. This idea that these calls are all going to be deadly if we don't send a police officer, it just turns out to be completely not true. In the area around Eugene, Oregon, where I was last week, they have a community-based organization that's integrated into the 911 system. They divert 20% of all 911 calls to these civilian teams. And the outcomes are tremendously positive, and there's no violence. So let's just start doing this. Houston, Portland, a growing number of cities are developing these teams, and we don't need police co-response. We need no police on these teams. Now, will there still be calls where someone is waving a gun around or shooting at people? Yes, for the time being, there will still be calls like that, and I'm sure that police will be sent. But that is a tiny, tiny fraction of what police actually do all day. So let's get rid of the stuff where we don't need them, and then we'll work on the other stuff.
Yeah, that's a great point, Professor Vitale. And I know in a previous conversation that Grant and Amari and I had, we identified that approximately 1 out of every 4 police shootings is related to mental health, or where the subject, the victim of the shooting, was suffering from a mental health episode. So that is a great point that you.
It may be as much as half, actually.
More even than 1 out of 4.
Yeah, maybe as much as 1 out of 2.
1 out of 2. Okay, thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, well, we don't know for sure because the police won't give us the information.
Of course.
So, but people who've been looking at this have found between 25 and 50% of all police killings involve someone with a mental health crisis or some other disability.
Got it. So it is. We're just about out of time, Professor Vitale, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about the Policing and Social Justice Project. I realized I didn't have the full name typed out on your banner there. My apologies, but the organization that you helped found was the Policing and Social Justice Project. So I've got the information here on the screen. Would you be so kind as to share a little bit about this organization with us?
Sure. So we've been around for about 6 years now, and here in New York City, one of the main things we do is that we helped create the Gangs Coalition, that is made up of directly impacted family members, community-based groups, legal advocates, academics like myself, who are fighting against the criminalization of the youth through things like gang databases, wide-ranging conspiracy cases, social media surveillance, and all the rest, and instead demanding that the city invest in social inclusion strategies, violence interruption strategies, etc. Nationally, we work on a lot of projects. I'm working with folks in LA County on alternatives to school policing. I'm working in Memphis on alternatives to traffic enforcement. We also have projects internationally. I'm working with folks in Colombia. I'll be headed down to Colombia next month, working with Amnesty International in Kenya. So around the world, people are trying to figure out how to replace policing in as many ways as we possibly can. and I'm doing whatever I can to help them with that.
Got it. Thank you for that insight. And we hope that our listeners check out the organization and support in any way that they can. And of course, get active in their own communities. Before we let you go, Professor Vitale, is there anything else that we didn't ask you about tonight that you wanted to share with us and our viewers?
Well, people can follow me on Twitter at @avitale. And, part of what we do at the Policing and Social Justice Project is at Policing J, policing and then the letter J. And we try to act as a kind of network hub, connecting people who need resources, ideas, reports, connections to journalists, who's doing this in a different city. So networking activists nationally and internationally.
Okay. Tell us those handles again one more time, Professor Vitale, for those that just went and grabbed a pen and pencil.
Right. So I'm at Vitale, AVITALE, and at Policing J.
Okay. All right. Well, Professor Vitale, we are honored by your presence tonight. We appreciate deeply and admire the work that you are doing and have been doing. And we hope that we can catch up with you again sometime soon.
Yeah, I'd be great to. I'm hoping to get to Detroit before too long. I have some friends at the Detroit Justice Center, and I've given some talks there and in Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti, and so I'm hoping to, now that we're traveling more again, I'm hoping to be out that way before too long.
All right. Well, we'll have to find you and connect with you when you visit.
Great.
All right. Take care, sir.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Man.
Wow.
Gee.
Yeah. Really,
really. Yeah, you were handling the chat there, good brother. What are your reactions, man? What's on your mind?
Well, it was very eye-opening. He actually brought some strategies to mind that I hadn't really thought about. Because I'll be honest, some of the questions that came up, I kind of had questions were in my mind as well, and he answered them greatly. So I definitely had some of those same questions. But what I was wondering though, and we didn't have time to get to ask him this, but maybe some folks out there who are listening may have a reaction of some sort. But I wonder if it's more so if the police were disarmed, if they didn't carry a weapon, a gun, and perhaps, just say a gun. There are other preventative weapons that they do carry, such as, the taser. We don't see anybody using the baton anymore, but that was at one point in time, that was some type of preventative weapon to instead of using or alternative weapon other than the gun. So, and I've seen even some cases where you may even have someone use some mace. But there are 19 countries who their police officers do not carry firearms. Out of those 19 countries, I would say maybe 9 of those are considered to be some of the safest countries in the world. So is there a correlation of the fact that these policemen have, would he be winning the end policing if they didn't carry a firearm? Yep. Is that in fact the issue here? So I think that is something that has been tossed around as an idea, but I know that America is very sensitive to that, because when you try to come for their guns, because if you disarm a police officer, then that's really saying you're going to disarm all Americans. I mean, that's a fight on this in itself. You have many people talk about they have a civil war in their hands to try to do something like that. But I just wonder, is it the police carrying the firearm is the real threat that's causing the problems, or is it the fact of just policing overall that we just really can't trust one person to come in an aggressive nature that sometimes often escalates situations instead of actually helping the situation? Or they need to have these professionals, as you talked about, mental health professionals, social workers, community leaders, have them come in place, which I think that's what he talked about the strategy was, them to respond to the situation other than a police officer who isn't trained to deal with that particular problem. Now, I did see in the chat, though, it's some interesting conversations here, people going back and forth. One gentleman said that a police officer has more bargaining power or than a social worker, which I thought to be kind of interesting, because I wonder what he meant by that. Is it solely because he shows up with a badge and a gun that he can get somebody to react other than a social worker? I beg to differ on that, because a social worker is actually trained more.
Absolutely.
Than a police officer is going to use his aggression. He's going to be coming there. We know the statistics show that most 911 calls are escalated when the police get there. It turns from just a disturbance to possibly then a shooting or to some type of violent takedown where the suspect needs medical attention. Right. So I wanted to kind of get into that more with him, but those are some of the things that are on my mind.
Yeah. Okay. Well, those are great thoughts, and we'll definitely come back to this topic another time. I know it's just a little bit past 8 o'clock, and we have a couple of things that we want to share with our audience before we close out. So there you go, Brother Grant.
All right. Well, we want you all to definitely continue to keep coming every week. Next week is going to be our 360 takeout edition. This is where we have started this probably more than a year now, where we started it based on those coming to, the point of it was to support local businesses, and we call it takeout because you're supposed to get takeout from a local restaurant. During the pandemic, many restaurants were closed and they only had takeout as an option, but many restaurants were actually closed for good because they could not sustain themselves. So the idea was to keep these businesses open. I know things are wide open now, but we still want to be able to have that as a tradition of ours. So we're going to be back next Thursday with our takeout edition, same time, 8 o'clock. We hope to see you back there. We are live on Facebook and YouTube. And for the YouTube algorithm, those who are listening on YouTube, please hit the like button. That's how the algorithm gets out and people are able to see us, and then also share it as well. Share this video tonight as well with your friends and family.
And I guess just to add to the 360 takeout, what we'll be doing is discussing a range of different topics from the lens of social consciousness and from a racialized point of view as well. So we will cover a variety of topics, and we will welcome comments and even engagement from the audience, so that we can talk directly with you and react directly with you to your thoughts and ideas and reactions to what we're saying and to what we're talking about. So we'll be talking about current events next week. So that's happening next week. And then here's the other thing we're excited to share.
So we are turning our work into some consulting. We are excited about this. We have got a lot of questions. We have been asked to do some consulting behind the scenes, but we now are launching our actual consulting business with media publishing and consulting, Real Power of People. So our organization, so we consult, basically help people, groups, organizations realize their most important goals and solve their most pressing problems through what we define as the aspects of revolutionary culture. We empower our partners to embrace, establish, and nurture attitudes, strategies, and habits essential for dynamic transformation, growth, and development. So here's our information here. If you have any type of business, any type of school districts, wherever you think it might need some consulting with the type of work that we do, please give us our email addresses here, info@360 Collective Online. Feel free to give us a call and check our website out as well, 360collective.online. That's something new we just kind of put together. We're really excited about it. And so we're not trying to necessarily get rich off this. This is something that we're looking to do. Everything we've done up to this point has been free to you all. We haven't asked for any donations. We haven't asked for anything, but we know we have been getting asked for doing different things and pull different directions, which will require travel and more of our time. So there will be some compensation involved in it, but more importantly, we're willing to branch out and spread our expertise and strategies all over the country. So if you're interested, please get in contact with us.
Yeah.
So I still see people are still going strong in the chat, and I like the conversation. I don't really want to end this. I wish we're going to have to revisit this because I see this as a topic that people are very interested in and have a lot to say. We want to actually may want to get some of you on talk with you live. So we're going to probably do this conversation again pretty soon, sooner than later, because I do think a lot of people have a lot to say, and it's very near and dear to some people, and some people actually have experienced some trauma dealing with police as well. As I saw one lady in the chat lost a child to a police officer. So we don't want to ignore that. We don't want to disrespect anybody's comments here. We want to let you know that we are reading them and we are taking these things to heart. We Professor Vitale just couldn't stay on any longer, but we are here though. So this may come up. Actually, maybe we'll slide this in maybe as one of the points for next week, so we can kind of continue the conversation.
Yep, that's what I was just gonna say, comrade. Was we hope that you all come back next week to engage in the conversation with us. We will add this as one of the topics so that you can continue the conversation. Check out our Facebook page. You can like our page if you haven't already. You can find next week's 360 Takeout slated as an event. You can record yourself as either interested or as coming to that event so that you get a reminder in your Facebook feed. We'll be here. And then also you can visit us on our site. We're glad to consult, support, coach, problem solve, professionally develop organizations, groups, and we are incredibly flexible in the work that we're doing and how we're doing it. So we hope that you will stick with us. We definitely want to stick with you. And yeah, we hope to see you next week. So I guess, yeah, this is a good place to stop there, brother.
All right, good brother. Well, it was been great tonight, and thank you all for sticking around with us as long as you have. And we'll see you next week. Real Powers people.